Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, and this is the award-winning Power in Politics podcast. Thanks for joining us for the conversation about the issues that are impacting you the most with the people that are making the decisions, the advocates that are fighting for change, along with everyone else in between, holding them accountable along the way. Today we speak with another reporter, Jon Campbell from WNYC, also the Gothamist. He just finished up some deep-seated reporting, this on Peanut the Squirrel and the aftermath of all of that. He did a FOIL request where he got documents, he got voicemails. He spoke to a lot of the people involved in that case as well. Something you're not familiar with. This happened just before the November election. The DEC euthanizing what had become a viral squirrel. It became a viral story at that. So Jon walks us through his reporting and the impact it's had to this day to the DEC and beyond. Thanks as always for joining us. You can subscribe wherever you get your Power in Politics podcast. Also, you can watch us on CBS 6 Albany's YouTube page. Jon Campbell joins us here today. He's a reporter with WNYC and Gothamist. Jon, we really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
Yeah, so this comes on the heels of your special report on WNYC Now, where you did this deep dive on Peanut the Squirrel, a story that obviously went viral, national, anything you might want to imagine back in the fall, and then you go deeper into that as a part of this reporting that you did. I guess to sum it up first, if you can, for those that might not be fully aware of this story, can you give us a brief synopsis of what happened? I know it can be a little complicated, but let's start there.
Well, I mean, this is a story of an internet famous squirrel.
Yeah.
Odd line. I had acknowledged that's like kind of a weird sentence.
But this is also, for those of you that end up going to listen or read, like this is a whole niche on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you learned about.
Yeah. There are internet famous squirrels that do tricks or are shown in kind of humorous situations with their owners. And this might have been the most famous of them. It was Peanut the Squirrel, owned by a guy named Mark Longo, who's a 35-year-old who lives near the city of Elmira along the Pennsylvania border. He has an animal rescue down there, and Peanut was his star and had hundreds of thousands of followers on social media, now well into the millions, and would be wearing a cowboy hat one day, or would be nibbling on a waffle on another, or jumping from the fridge to Mark's hip, and had this big loyal following. And on October 30th, 2024, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, with search warrant in hand, went to his property and seized that animal as well as a raccoon named Fred. The animal, the squirrel, allegedly bit an officer at the scene, a wildlife specialist at the scene. And a decision was made by the Chemung County Health Department in consultation with state officials to euthanize the animals. And this was, I said, October 30th, 2024. This was in the days before the presidential election, and it erupted into this culture war where people, particularly those on the right, could not believe that a blue state like New York would go in and seize someone's animals. But it is illegal to keep a squirrel as a long-term pet in New York State, particularly without a license, an exhibitor's license or a rehabber's license. Mark Longo, according to the DEC, did not have that, had started the process but had not finished it. So there's two sides to this story, but it grew into this big, huge culture war in the final days of the election, and many of your viewers probably heard something about this story because it was talked about by J.D. Vance and Elon Musk and Joe Rogan. I mean, it was a big deal.
Yeah, and I think you think about it and you listen and read what you're reporting on this. It's very much, I think, if someone asked you how would you describe the world, society in 2025, it's probably this story. When you think of the social, like you said, the cultural, but also the social media and just how it feels extreme, but also a lot of this is life these days. Obviously, this is that to the umpteenth example, an umpteenth level of that. But it feels like a lot of this encapsulates. You have government, you have polarization, you have politicization of a topic, and then you have a social media backlash, right?
And I think one of the things that is so fascinating about this story is there's very little that's in dispute. Mark Longo does dispute whether that bite occurred. There several DEC officers included it in their write-ups and spoke about how there were or wrote up how There was a small wound on the wildlife agent's hand. But that seems to be really the only big thing in dispute here. But otherwise, it's kind of like a Rorschach test. Some people view this and see clear government overreach. And other people look at this and say, well, he didn't have a license. He was warned in the months prior, and rules are rules. So it's very, very, depending on how you look at this story, you can come to very different conclusions.
Why, for you, what triggered taking it a little bit deeper, and filing some of the requests you did, and looking at this from a different angle, a different lens, because obviously, a lot, like you said, this was in election season last fall. Here we are in August of the following year, almost at this point. For you, why'd you want to do more and dig more into this?
Well, I mean, anytime there's some sort of big viral story that kind of captures the nation's attention, in this case, like, you want to dig deeper, especially when it's on our home turf, New York State here. So we filed Freedom of Information Law requests, which allow members of the public and reporters to request public records from their government. And we filed one, other people filed it as well, and it resulted in this cache of documents and officer write-ups that really told the story, but also included dozens and dozens of voicemails that were left for the DEC, and make a big part of our podcast, because these voicemails that came in from all over the country and all over the world were incredibly violent in some cases. They were incredibly threatening, and when you listen to these voicemails, I mean, they stop you in your tracks. I mean, people threatening murder, threatening specific violent acts against specific people within the DEC for what they did to Peanut the Squirrel. And it's had a real serious impact on the agency itself. We spoke to the union rep for DEC officers who spoke about how in the months that followed Peanut's seizure and ultimate euthanization, that they waited weeks and weeks and weeks to get sign-off from DEC leadership to to engage in a search warrant or to seize wildlife. We, on the Gothamist version of our story, we open with a scene of a big game wildlife checkpoint during hunting season on the Throgs Neck Bridge from the Bronx to Queens, and that was not in place after Peanut the Squirrel. It had been in place in years prior, but there was a lot of concern within the DEC to re-stoke this viral mob that scared a lot of people within that agency. There were bomb threats to 10 different DEC buildings across the state, and thousands of workers worked from home. I mean, it was during that period. It was a scary situation and continues to have a real life impact on the agency. Was
that the motivation behind the FOIL request? Because I think we all heard about the bomb threats and that the DEC had been under fire, if you will. Did you have an inkling that those voicemails were in there, or I guess what was behind those threats, or did that just kind of come and you were like, wow, like what is this?
It was primarily to try to tell the real story of what happened, right? And how do you do that? You need all the internal documents that you can get, all the internal records you can get. By the time we did get that FOIL request back, which was I want to say April or so, the voicemails, just the amount of the voicemails really was surprising and staggering, and kind of stopped us in our track and said, okay, how can we go about telling this story using these voicemails? I work primarily in an audio medium, and podcast worked really well for that, because those voicemails will stop you in your track. You can understand hearing them why there was so much fear within the agency, and why people were so afraid. They were very violent and threatening.
Something else that you found I want to get a little bit more into the DC aspect of this, the agency in a moment, but I did want to ask another level of the reporting was Monica Keeler, right? Is that her name? Keesler. Sorry, yes. Monica Keesler, and these other Monicas that you came across. How did, that you interview and you speak with, right? How did you come across these other individuals that didn't seem to have anything to do with any of this, that were also seeing the impacts of all of this? How did you come upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Monica Keesler is a photographer in Texas who was active in these squirrel rehabbing Facebook groups, private Facebook groups with thousands of members, things that I had no idea these existed.
Right.
And she almost immediately, in the days that followed Peanut's seizure and euthanization, her name was bouncing all over the internet. Just people blaming her for being the person to call in the complaints that led to Peanut the Squirrel's seizure. And, there were fake social media posts that claimed to be her taking credit for it, and just wasn't real. She filed her own FOIL request and the DEC said, no, we don't have any document of you complaining about Peanut the Squirrel or this situation at all. But, her contact information all over the internet, she was getting all sorts of death threats, etc., to the point where now it's difficult to contact her. I wasn't able to reach contact with her. But I did find these other photographers named Monica, one in Missouri, one in Northern California, another one in Texas, who just by having the same first name and profession as the woman who was being blamed for this, they got all sorts of threats and they got all sorts of angry, false reviews to their page. And they say that it's harmed their photography businesses to this day. I spoke to one who said she's lost about $25,000 just on lost graduation shoots and lost wedding shoots. And so just the tentacles of this are just they just go and go and go and go.
And you spoke, so I guess we're in the middle here, but who did you speak to for, I guess, the spot? Who do we hear from in the podcast specifically?
We hear from Mark Longo, who is the,
I want to make sure people know that you spoke with him.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. He's the owner of Peanut the Squirrel. I spoke with him. I interviewed him for more than an hour, and also met with him when he came to the Capitol to push for a change in the law. Twice he came to the Capitol during the legislative session. You hear from Matthew Krug, who is the union representative for DEC officers. He's a DEC officer himself. He's the vice president of the union. Who believes that Mark Longo should face charges for this. They found a gun that DEC officers believe to be illegal at the property, as well as he thinks that he should face charges for illegal wildlife. Mark Longo says that the gun wasn't his; it was somebody else's. He put the officers in touch. You also hear from a couple of the Monicas, as we call them, the Monicas. Yeah. And you hear from, it's just, you hear the voicemails too, which is kind of the centerpiece of the whole thing.
Yeah, I want to make sure people knew that you did speak with Mark Longo because that triggered my thoughts, because you did ask him about the name Monica and putting it out there too.
And not to derail the conversation here, but some of the early complaints that came in early 2024 about Mark showing Peanut the Squirrel on social media. They also mentioned that Mark has an OnlyFans page, and some people were accusing him of using Peanut the Squirrel to drive people to his sexually explicit OnlyFans page where he sells content.
Right.
He denies that very much so, but at the same time, his username on OnlyFans is Squirrel Daddy, and he makes very clear that he is, quote, Peanut's dad. So yet another tentacle in this story that's just full of it.
Right, never. That's one of the reasons why you're here, because it is fascinating. The other one was the agency itself. You alluded to the checkpoints. Yeah. Have you? I mean, you're someone that's covered the state capitol for a while, right? Yeah. A long time. How many years?
About 15, give or take.
Yeah. Have you seen an agency sort of be halted in its tracks like this before? Be under fire like this, in the state? Because obviously lots going on in your tenure in those last 15 years.
I mean, listen, nothing compared to COVID, right?
Right.
And COVID at a time when Andrew Cuomo was having press conferences every single day and making very consequential decisions. The Department of Health certainly was overrun with calls, and not just from citizens, but from businesses and just the scope of the effect of COVID. Nothing compares to that.
Yeah.
But in terms of like a viral mob looking for justice, I can't think of anything that rose to this level in the last 15 years that I've been covering. I mean, this was focused on one particular agency for what is a wildlife seizure in a small town, small hamlet in Chemung County, New York. I mean, it's the way, the enormity of the virality of the incident is difficult to compare with.
And the agency, too, I think it was an interesting place during all of this. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but this was coming off earlier in the year. Basil Sagos left, right? And they had, what was it, Brian Mahar, right?
Sean Mahar.
Sean Mahar, sorry. Sean Mahar was interim acting, I think he was interim. Right?
Yeah, this was at a point where there was a change in leadership, or they were in between leaders.
Right. Do you think that at all? You spoke to the Benevolent Association. Do you think that at all was that discussed at all when you spoke with anyone involved in this of just a change in, because the change in leadership, and obviously initially there was no warrant. They didn't go and do the search and seizure. And then the leadership change. I guess I'm just curious if that all is a dynamic that you came across.
Well, I should say the DEC leadership declined to speak on the record.
Yeah.
And they did provide some statements, and some information about how many buildings had bomb threats and the status of Mark Longo's license application, that kind of stuff. They were helpful on that front. But, I think it was very, very clear that leadership within the DEC and more broadly through the Hochul administration was very they were acting very delicately. They did not want to further stoke that viral mob that came for them, and you can certainly understand why in some respects. But at the same time, the officers who were on the ground and also getting threats, they very much wanted agency leadership to come out and say, hey, this is why we did what we did. Yeah. These are the steps we took. We got a search warrant signed by a judge because we saw evidence of illegal wildlife, potentially illegal wildlife, being held as a pet. So they very much wanted some sort of, they wanted to feel as if the agency had their back in that moment. And even still now, the DEC hasn't said much. There have been a couple very brief statements. One where the new agency commissioner who came into power in March, Amanda Lefton, she put out a statement saying essentially, we've done an internal review. We want to have body cams on our officers going forward. We want to do this. We want to do that. We know we can do better going forward. And that is a statement that you can interpret so many different ways. Yeah. But it's they haven't really said much even now, because there's still there still is a fear that they could restoke that fire.
Yeah. What about from Mark's standpoint? Where did you get a sense from where he was going to go from here?
He's suing. Is what it is, and he's suing. He's filed 2 lawsuits so far, and he said there's a third coming. One lawsuit is against Chemung County and some of the individual DEC officers. Another lawsuit is against the state of New York, where he's seeking at least $10 million in various damages, whether that's lost revenue to his animal sanctuary, where Peanut was his star and his biggest fundraising tool, or whether that's lost personal revenue too. He does in the lawsuit cite lost revenue potential for his OnlyFans page, and there's also damages, pecuniary damages, different kind of damages in there too. So he's seeking at least $10 million from the state. I mean, that he very recently filed that lawsuit, so there's a long way to go there. But yeah, no, he almost every single day is on social media in some form or fashion, kind of recounting the story. And he has a big following, and there's, on any given day, there's anywhere from several dozen to several hundred to 1,000 people watching his live streams where he raises money for his sanctuary and also recounts the story of Peanut.
That's what's interesting too, is that when it comes to social media, a lot of things like this, you talked about DEC still kind of being on guard. Yeah. A lot of these things don't die, right? I mean, it takes a while for them to even someone can bring it back up and be like, hey, look what happened here 2 years ago, right? I think that's another aspect of social media. It's interesting. You mentioned the legislation as someone that sees this come and go. Bills be introduced, people advocate at the Capitol. What layer does that bring, if any? Because I know it is a mainly Republican-backed bill.
Yeah,
right?
This is a bill that is known as Peanut's Law.
Yeah.
It is sponsored by a Democratic senator and a Republican assembly member. The Republican is Jake Blumenkrantz. He's from Long Island, and that is, Albany is a Democratic city. The state legislature is entirely Democratic run. So if you don't have a Democratic sponsor in the assembly, it's pretty difficult to get your bill passed. But that being said, what it would do is it would do a few different things, but essentially it would force a waiting period on the DEC. If they seize wildlife, they would have to wait X amount of hours before, I believe it's 72 hours before they can euthanize. And the idea being that you observe for rabies symptoms, because that was the point of the euthanization, was there was concern about rabies, and particularly a raccoon can carry rabies, and if the raccoon, Fred the raccoon, was living with Peanut the Squirrel, who was living with humans, and the squirrel also allegedly bit a wildlife officer, then there's a rabies concern. So the idea behind the bill is observe rather than immediately euthanize. But there are problems with that too, according to Matt Krug, the DEC union rep. You need space to store and observe, and who is going to be in charge of that, and who's going to pay for that, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's issues there, according to the DEC officers union.
What did you learn, over the course of doing this reporting, and the conversations you had, what you found, what came to you?
What did I learn? I learned the real effect that the internet culture war can have on your government. That was the big takeaway that I had from this story, that there is a very real, very clear effect that continues to this day, and it is all because of this at times violent threats that were coming in. And it just was eye-opening in terms of, the big viral story, if you're not in the middle of it, can seem entertaining. But if you're in the middle of that, it's terrifying. It can be terrifying. It can have, when it involves a government agency like this, to the extent that it did, it can have a real impact on how your government operates.
Right. It's interesting because that takes it, in terms of policy then being impacted, right? If you think about in that aspect of things, because I remember...
Or at least enforcement.
Right.
Or enforcement of policy.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about what lawmakers are listening to.
Yeah.
Right? Because I remember it was a couple years ago when Governor Hochul was making maybe her first or second round of bail reform changes.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in a press conference and asked her about the data. If people understand that it's hard to find data that corresponds to bail reform and a rise in crime, but that's a whole different story. Yeah. But she goes, well, I've seen the headlines. I've seen the story. A lot of times that was during election season, a lot of political ads out there. So it's kind of interesting to me how stuff like this can then impact how lawmakers feel about things, and then what they do in turn because of that.
Yeah, and so far lawmakers have not haven't acted, right? And there's no, it doesn't, they didn't act in this session. I'm sure that Assemblymember Blumenkranz and Senator Scarcella-Stanton on the Democratic side, who is the sponsor, will continue to push. This has been, to this point, more inside the DEC, which is an executive agency, right? So it's been more, the DEC is in charge of protecting wildlife and protecting natural resources and enforcing environmental and wildlife laws.
Yeah.
And that is really where we've seen the biggest effect to this point.
And also the kind of a level of transparency too. Right.
Yeah,
when it comes to accessing, I'm sure trying to get interviews with the DEC commissioner and everything, and is a little bit different than it was before.
Yeah, there's a couple levels to the transparency thing here. I mean, the DEC leadership did not agree to an on-the-record interview, and that certainly I would have loved to have spoken to them, but at the same time, they did release these hundreds of records that really helped tell the story. So. And that was through a Freedom of Information law request, which is the law. Public records are public,
but those
a lot of times you have to fight for them.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and this, I didn't really have to put up a fight for the records.
Okay.
I didn't at all. I mean, I filed the request, and a few months later, I got the records. Okay. So, different levels of transparency here, but certainly would have loved to have talked to DC leadership on the record.
We'll have links to everything, but if you want to tell people how they can find the reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find the written version on Gothamist.com. Just search for Peanut, and the half-hour podcast episode, which really gets into the whole thing, you can find in the NYC Now podcast feed.
All right, and that's where you can hear the voicemails. You can hear some of your interviews you did. Really good stuff, Jon. Great reporting. Thanks so much for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.